I tested some Maxpeedingrods coilovers 6 years ago and honestly they were terrible. But fast forward to the end of 2023 and I've got a new set. So we're going to find out how they compare and how they've improved and how they stack up against something worth 5 times the price. This video really does feel a little bit like deja vu, but I'm actually keen to see how these compare to the set I tested back in 2017. I tested a non-adjustable coilover from Maxpeedingrods, the yellow version. These are now their latest blue and black iteration. Quite a nice look to them, but how will they actually perform? We will find out. So how's this going to go down? Step 1, get these things out of the box, have a quick peruse over what they look like in terms of build quality. Number 2 is get them in the car. I've done that many times before, particularly in the MX-5, so that's going to be a breeze. And then number 3 is, of course, get this thing out on the road and do a bit of a road test and find out what they're like in terms of performance compared to something worth quite a lot more. For comparison's sake, this is a set of MCA brand coilovers. You're looking at around about 2,000 Aussie dollars, whereas these are about 400 Aussie dollars for the Maxpeedingrods. You're not going to really find much under the $2,000 mark that's of a name brand, particularly for an MX-5. These things are built and spec'd and valved to the MX-5. These, I don't know. Now, my experience with the previous iteration was pretty bad. They were very crashy and hard. The valving was very poor. They didn't dampen well, despite having relatively soft springs. They weren't adjustable in terms of damping. They were only adjustable in spring and shock length, which meant that I actually couldn't get them low enough to sit even appropriate on the car, even just at a static ride height. They looked way too high, particularly in the rear. The shock was clearly just kind of a standard shock, and they hadn't set it specific to the MX-5, so it was a pretty bad experience. In the end, I took them out immediately after. There was no way I was going to leave them in the car. They were literally crap. I got roasted in the comments, as you'd expect on YouTube, people telling me I set them up wrong or I adjusted them wrong. That's a matter of opinion. I'm quite well versed in MX-5s and in suspension. I've had, I don't know, 10 different types of damper and shock in my MX-5s. I am also a relatively competent driver, not a professional, but I do have a fairly fast MX-5 that has lap records. So it's not a slow car and I'm not exactly a shit driver. So suffice to say, I kind of have a bit of experience. Now in terms of the makeup of these shocks, relatively straightforward, pretty much the same as any other shock for an MX-5. We have an adjustable base with a collar, we have a spring with its adjustable perch, and a knob up the top for damper adjustment. That's kind of the basic minimum you expect from a shock, aftermarket shock these days. Now, depending on who you talk to, some people on the internet will say you should adjust this piece to adjust your ride height. Some people say you should adjust the spring pre-tension to adjust your ride height. I'm going to leave you people in the comments to make your own opinions on that. The instructions from Maxpeedingrods say to adjust the bottom section and not to touch the spring to adjust ride height. Keep that in mind when we get to the install part of this video. Overall, I don't see a drastic change in quality over the old yellow ones. It's not bad. It actually looks pretty good on face value, at least from an exterior perspective. I like the new color scheme. It's definitely an improvement from the yellow. We've got machined aluminium top hats, a nice little adjustment knob up the top here, 24-point adjustment. Fairly standard rubber bushing in the bottom. That's nothing I wouldn't expect. And that's about it. Pretty straightforward. I will say spring rates do seem to be a little bit light. 6 kilos appears in the rear, 7 in the front, so not exactly a heavy rate spring. Probably appropriate for a general road use car. As soon as you start to hit the track, that's probably a little bit light and definitely stiffer than stock.
Furthermore, the adjustment rings appear to be quite nice in this tidy machined grey. The front shocks have these mounting tabs welded on for the MX-5 ABS sensor wire bracket, which is a welcome addition. The shock shaft have dust boots, which is a neat way to keep dirt and debris away from the important bits and aid with reliability and longevity. I do note one of the studs here is canted off slightly outboard. It's not perfectly vertical.
Now in terms of installation process, I will caveat this by saying technically the right way to do this is to install the damper without the spring attached to ensure that we get full motion of travel and the wheel doesn't bind up with the inner wheel arch. So you do that by setting effectively your minimum depth or your bump stop on your shock so that when the shock is fully compressed and it's on the bump stop, the wheel is not rubbing on the guard. I'm not going to do that. The instructions say don't touch the spring, so I'm going to do what I'm told. In my opinion, that can lead to an incorrectly installed shock.
The shock that just come out, the shock that's about to go in, and there is a massive difference in overall length. Bit hard to see on camera, but it's at least an inch and a half or so. Now, there is adjustability in this shot length here, so obviously I can make a bit of a change there, but the overall height clearly has not been kind of set from factory, shall we say. Now, let's see what we can do with adjustment here. Because I know the problem with the previous version was that you could only wind the bottom in so far before it was already bottomed out on the shock. So clearly that problem hasn't changed. That's just been wound in all the way, and we're still a good inch longer, which means we're potentially a good in the range of about an inch higher. Now this car wasn't dumped before, but it certainly wasn't high, shall we say. You wouldn't want to go much lower than what I already had on this car for most normal street cars. And already we're looking at an inch higher potentially, depending on the spring rate and things, because obviously how much rate we have may impact how low the car sits. But let's throw this in. Interesting already. I'm becoming a little bit more skeptical, which I shouldn't be. But let's find out what happens when we actually get this back on the car. Right off the bat, that's like four-wheel drive height. It's not looking good. I'm trying not to be biased here, and I'm trying not to be a skeptic, but all signs point to nothing has improved. Or very little at least. I wound the shock bottom in as far as I could, and we've got this much gap. I'm sorry, but an adjustable shock, particularly for a performance car, shouldn't be at ride height at its lowest setting. Let's just find out how the thing handles, and maybe it's like amazing and we're, you know. Got the first of two shocks out from the front now. Similar story to the rear. The one that was on the car is quite a bit shorter, a good 1 or 2 inches than the Maxpeedingrods rod. Again, let's see how much of adjustability we've got in the bottom before it fully bottoms out. Well, in this case, we've wound right up to the spring base, and again, we're still a good nearly an inch longer.
I did encounter a significant issue here when it came to setting the base height for the second of the front shocks. In the location where this tab had been welded onto the lower mount, it had burnt through the tube, resulting in this blob of metal inside. This prevented the shock from being wound in fully, which was a significant issue for setting these up properly. Now, I did correct it myself by taking to it with a die grinder. There was just enough room to get it down in there to remove the lump of metal. But that's an issue that's not necessarily something that the average Joe would pick up, nor would it be necessarily easy for them to fix.
So it's time for the fun bit where we get to go in the car and drive it and find out what the suspension is like. I've got my expert alongside me to hopefully keep me on my toes and tell me if I'm doing the wrong thing here, but on face value, so far, suspension feeling okay. I've got it all set on the softest setting pretty much, so shocks are set to about 5 or 6 clicks from softest out of the 24 clicks that it has in total adjustment. So right off the bat, I'd say the soft setting is probably a bit too soft for this type of driving, but that said, it definitely feels okay, if that makes sense. Now, I do find that on the more gradual bumps, these shocks seem to hold up okay. The shock and spring sort of match well, but for the crashy stuff, the real sudden bumps like a pothole or something, it feels a very aggressive bump. So maybe the high-speed valving is different, or it's a, you know, it's not a kind of variable valve or something inside that shock, and so when it's a sudden bump like that, it doesn't feel great. So we've had a quick run in the car. It's time to swing it around and head back. I've adjusted the shocks up to a more stiffer setting, so let's see how the dampers handle that higher, stiffer setting
in an exciting bit of driving. Wow, definitely that's woken up the car. It's much firmer now, much more pointed. Now, of course, before we had a compliant soft ride, which was probably nice for every day. Bit of a higher speed section here, but we've still got some curves through the road, and there's a few bumps like here. Oh, not bad, handled it okay, not too crashy. Caught up to some traffic, but look, on the firm setting, it's not uncomfortable. It's quite drivable. It's quite pleasant. If anything, I'd say it's probably how I prefer the car to be for me. But that said, if I was driving this absolutely every day, I'd probably dial it back down to one of those lower settings. We've got a bit more compliance, a bit more comfort. When you hit a bump or something, it doesn't kind of ride up your back quite as aggressive. Definitely roads like this are something of what the Mazda MX-5 was made for. This car feels at home driving around here. It just feels nimble, it feels light, fingertip steering. It's such a place for this MX-5 to be. They just love it. And with this suspension, it's way better than like the stock stuff. I can't drive an MX-5 that's got stock suspension. I'm markedly impressed with how this stuff has improved. Now maybe mostly that's a case of the damper and the adjustability, I'm sure, but there's still some build quality issues there with that Maxpeedingrods stuff. The poor adjustability in height alone, the poor adjustability in the shock length alone is a reason to not buy them. Not to mention the slightly iffy build quality. The actual ride quality, the damping adjustment, all of that stuff, way better than it used to be. Actually drivable. But I'm not driving around in a four-wheel drive every day. I'm not driving around in an off-roader MX-5. The wheel gap on the back here looks stupid. No normal person is going to do it. It's, if anything, higher than stock, and it's on the lowest setting. Not good enough. If they're doing some actual R&D and actually testing a product in a real car, they put it on one car and see how bad it is. I can't comprehend how they're building this product, thousands of them, and not knowing that this is an issue. It's been an issue for over 6 years, and it's still an issue today. I don't know what to tell you. But the last video on this stuff, I got roasted in the comments by people who didn't really know what they were doing and didn't necessarily have experience, or perhaps they were using the Maxpeedingrods in a different car. But in the Mazda MX-5, they're not good enough.
I have to say, having driven the car now, this is a marked improvement over the old version. Damping quality is way better. That may be attributed just to being able to adjust the damper at the top here. I'm not sure, but definitely way more comfortable, way more compliant, and then much less crashy than the older iteration. But there's still a significant problem. Firstly, just the shock adjustability is very poor. The base height is not set correctly for an MX-5. If the minimum I wind these shocks in is still higher than stock, these are not appropriately adjustable for the car. Effectively, I need to get a shorter shock to make this work, or a shorter spring, which is not what they tell you to do in the instructions. I should be able to set this correctly from factory. It can't do that. The other thing is the quality is still a little bit questionable. Most notably, the welds on the inside of the front shock, which rendered the bottom mount not able to fully seat onto the shock. Not good. Otherwise, the actual ride quality is great. Adjustability is great. The cost, it's pretty hard to beat.